You know, we all think we know the difference between fiction and nonfiction. It's pretty simple, right? One's true, one's made up. But then, where does poetry fit in? And what happens when you read a true story that feels more like a thriller novel? Well, it turns out the lines between these categories are a lot blurrier than you might think, and today we are going to get right into it.
On the surface, it really does seem simple. Fiction is the stuff we invent. Nonfiction is what actually happened. But have you ever read a memoir that was so beautifully written it felt like the best novel you've ever picked up? Or a poem that just hits you with a truth that feels more real than any news report? That's when you start to realize, yeah, these lines aren't just blurry, sometimes they're practically invisible.
All right, so let's start with the classic divide, the one we all learned back in school. Because to really understand where things get fuzzy, we first have to draw those lines nice and clear. Okay, so on one hand, you've got fiction. These are the works of pure imagination. Think about your favorite fantasy series, a mind-bending sci-fi movie, a great mystery novel, all of it created from scratch. And on the other hand, you have nonfiction. This is the world of facts, reality, and true events. Biographies, history books, documentaries. If you can prove it happened, it goes in this bucket.
So, a novel about dragons is fiction. A biography about a president is nonfiction. Simple enough, right? Case closed. Well, not so fast, because there's this other major player in the game that doesn't really fit neatly into either of those boxes. And that, of course, brings us to poetry, the wild card of the literary world. This is where our nice, clean, two-sided system really starts to fall apart. See, poetry is one of the oldest forms of literature, and it has pretty much always been a rule breaker.
If you look up the standard definition of poetry, it talks all about rhythm and imagination and creating pleasure. The word itself actually comes from an old Greek word that just means to make. So a poet is literally a maker. But notice what that definition doesn't mention. Yeah, it says absolutely nothing about whether a poem has to be true or false.
Which lands us right here at the central puzzle. If a poet writes about a real experience, something that genuinely happened to them, is that poem nonfiction? And if they write about, I don't know, talking to the moon, is it fiction? What exactly are we dealing with here?
Now, here is a twist you might not see coming. If you walk into pretty much any library or bookstore, you'll almost always find the poetry section filed under nonfiction. And it's not because every poem is a true story. It's actually because of how library systems like the Dewey Decimal System are organized. It's just too hard to sort poetry into all the little fiction subgenres, so it gets its own big category that just happens to fall under the nonfiction umbrella. How weird is that?
So, to solve this puzzle, maybe we've been asking the wrong question the whole time. Instead of asking if a poem is true, maybe we should be asking, what makes a poem a poem? And the answer, it turns out, has a lot less to do with facts and a whole lot more to do with form.
The poet Louis Zukofsky had this really brilliant way of thinking about it. He said the test of poetry isn't about truth at all. It's about the experience it creates for the reader. And he broke that experience down into 3 parts: sight, sound, and intellect. Let's unpack that a little. Sight is literally about how the poem looks on the page. You know, the line breaks, the empty spaces, the shape of the stanzas. It's a visual art. Then there's sound. That's the rhythm, the rhyme, the pure music the words make when you read them out loud. And finally, intellect. This is the deeper meaning, the magic trick of using things like metaphors and symbols to suggest huge ideas without ever saying them outright. Oh, Alexander Pope was an absolute master of this. He wrote this line: "Soft is the strain when zephyr gently blows," and all those soft S and Z sounds literally sound like a gentle breeze. But then in the very next line, he writes, "The hoarse, rough verse should like the torrent roar." And all those hard R sounds, you can hear the roaring torrent he's describing. The sound becomes the meaning. Now that's what makes poetry so incredibly unique. And you know what? It turns out it's not just poetry that lives in this fascinating gray area. The lines between fiction and nonfiction have been getting blurrier for a long, long time, and it's created some of the most powerful writing out there. So, welcome to the world of creative nonfiction. This whole genre is dedicated to telling true stories about real people and real events. But it does so using all the cool tricks from the fiction writer's toolbox. We're talking character development, vivid settings, a strong narrative voice. It's all fact, but it's told like a story. And we see this everywhere. Truman Capote famously called his masterpiece, In Cold Blood, a nonfiction novel.
Norman Mailer won a Pulitzer for The Armies of the Night, which is basically him reporting on a protest he was actually in. And then you get somebody like Vladimir Nabokov, who writes Pale Fire, a novel that's completely disguised to look like a boring, scholarly analysis of a poem, complete with a foreword and footnotes. I mean, he's just deliberately playing with our expectations of what a book is supposed to be.
So this really gets to the heart of it. Maybe the real difference isn't just about facts versus lies. Maybe it's about the kind of truth we're looking for. This quote nails it. A novel might not be factually true, but it represents a truth, some kind of universal truth about what it means to be human. A memoir, on the other hand, commits to telling the truth, the specific verifiable facts of what actually went down.
Okay, so with this new understanding, let's try and build a better framework. We can organize these genres not just by whether they're true, but by their form, their relationship to truth, and their ultimate goal.
So let's look at this new framework based on those three key things. First up, form. Fiction and nonfiction, they both typically use prose, sentences and paragraphs. Poetry, on the other hand, uses verse, lines and stanzas. Next, truth. Fiction offers a truth about life. Nonfiction offers the truth about what happened. And poetry, well, it can do either, or both at the same time. And finally, goal. Fiction's main goal is imaginative storytelling. Nonfiction's goal is to inform or recount, and poetry's goal is to make us feel something, to evoke emotion and reflection.
Ultimately, what this all boils down to is this. The genre isn't just defined by its factual content. It's defined by the structure, the language, and the intent behind it. The how of the story is every bit as important as the what.
And that really leads us with a much bigger question, doesn't it? If the form of a story, the way it's told, can be just as important as the facts inside it, how does that change the way we read the news, or watch a documentary, or even just listen to a friend telling us about their day? The way we tell our stories literally shapes our reality. It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.